Okay, let me just set. Okay, so just to start with a bit of context, the paper that I'm working on is aiming to capture a type of epistemic harm that arises from fake news, namely the harm that's inflicted on our epistemic or our intellectual character. And I'm going to argue that fake news creates or strengthens epistemic vices in people and suppresses their epistemic virtues. And insofar as fake news threatens our intellectual character, I'm going to argue that it's epistemically corrupting, which is an underexplored but essential form of corruption, which I think is vital to our understandings of the different harms and wrongs of fake news. And epistemic corruption is discussed extensively by vice epistemologist Ian Kidd. So he's developed a framework, or like a criteria, for a corruption criticism, which is just to criticize something as epistemically corrupting. So my talk is going to follow this framework to make a epistemic corruption criticism of the media or information disorder in particular. So firstly, when I'm talking about online environments, I'm going to focus on online media environments. And instead of using the term fake news, I'm going to be a bit more specific and accurate and actually talk about information disorder. And information disorder refers to the numerous ways that online information can distort the truth and our trust in the media. And information disorder itself is an umbrella term used to describe three main types of distortion in the media. So there's disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. So disinformation is content which is intentionally false and designed to cause harm. And an example of this was the claims that were made by Donald Trump and others during Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, which basically denied that Obama held an American passport. And this information was intentionally false and designed to cause harm to Obama's presidential campaign, as the claims falsely asserted that he wasn't able to be president because he wasn't a natural born citizen. Then we have misinformation. So this is false information that's spread, but no harm has been intended. And examples of misinformation are often found when reports of terrorist attacks are made on social media. And this often involves a social media user publishing various rumors about an attack. And the people sharing this type of content are rarely doing so to cause harm, but they just do as a mistake of not fully understanding the full facts. And then finally, we have malinformation. So this is information that's based on reality, which is then used to inflict harm on a person or an organization or country. And an example of this is when Russian agents hacked into emails from the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign, and they leaked certain details to the public in order to damage reputation. So those are the main definitions of information disorder. So I'm now going to turn to epistemic vices. So a fairly recent area of epistemology is vice epistemology, and this is just the study of epistemic vices, which are defined as different character traits, attitudes, or thinking styles, which systematically prevent us from acquiring knowledge. So in very simple terms, they are the opposite of epistemic virtues. And they can be vicious because they obstruct knowledge, or that they include a bad motive towards something epistemically bad, or maybe just because they result in bad epistemic effects, which is going to depend on what definition of vice you go with. And some examples of well-known vices include gullibility, arrogance, and closed-mindedness. So taking closed-mindedness, we could define this as a vice if it's either a character trait, attitude, or thinking style, which it seems to be, which systematically, which just means consistently in this context, produces a bad epistemic effect, or it prevents us from gaining knowledge. And it seems that closed-mindedness does make us miss out on knowledge if we were consistently being closed-minded, which means it can be defined as an epistemic vice. Okay, so now turning to corruption. So the general meaning of corruption is understood as articulating damage or forms of degeneration, and it's usually confined to just moral and political philosophy. So the media, or information disorder in particular, can be corrupting in a moral or political sense. So the example of discrediting a political candidate in an election to influence public opinion, or we can think of physical harms and deaths brought about by conspiracy theories, such as horrific school shootings, for example, are both cases where information disorder is potentially politically and morally corrupting. But obviously, my focus is on epistemic corruption, which is defined by Kidd as occurring when your epistemic character comes to be damaged due to your interaction with persons, conditions, processes, doctrines, or structures which facilitate the development and exercise of epistemic vice. And the main purpose of research into epistemic corruption is to identify the relevant sort of factors or things which can lead to the formation or increase the presence of epistemic vices. And as I mentioned, when an institutional process is found to be corruptive, a corruptive criticism can then be directed towards it, which is what I'm doing with information disorder. Okay, so I want to note some key features of an epistemic corruption or the process of applying a corruption criticism to something. So firstly, I won't be arguing that information disorder always leads to the development of epistemic vices, but rather the idea is just that it can very easily do so. And this is an important clarification that Kidd notes about the general process of epistemic corruption, which is that it has no success condition. And this just means that the corruptive process doesn't need to inflict or promote vices in everyone who's been exposed to it. And just to explain this a bit more, so Kidd applies a corruptive criticism to education, and he gives an example in one of his papers, which is that an increasing reliance on technology in education enables students to offload their cognitive work onto external devices. So instead of developing virtues such as attentiveness and insightfulness, a reliance on technology would create vices such as epistemic laziness instead. However, not every student who incorporates technology in their learning would develop the vice of epistemic laziness, but it's just required that for the corruption criticism that some of them would do. And this is because there's a difference between strong and weak epistemically corrupting processes, with the former relating to ones which entrench multiple vices in many members of its system, and the latter which entrenches some vices in some of its members. And likewise, I claim that as long as some consumers of information disorder will form vices due to their exposure to it, then a corruptive criticism can be applied. And relatedly, Kidd claims that the epistemically corruptive systems don't have to intentionally aim to corrupt or promote epistemic vices. So in some cases, a process might be epistemically corruptive, even if a system's intended aim is to actually promote epistemic goods or even epistemic virtues. So bringing the discussion back to the media or information disorder, we can see that the aims and intentions for information disorder are varied. So as I've said, malinformation is spread with a direct intention to cause harm, whereas misinformation isn't shared with an intention to cause harm, but through inadequate fact-checking. Next, the damage or harm that epistemic corruption can cause on our character can also be defined as active or passive. So active corruption is damaging because it promotes or rewards the exercise of vice. And then passive corruption is damaging because it fails to effectively facilitate or encourage the exercise of virtue. And then finally, we can also characterize the difference between the corrupted, which is just the personal thing being corrupted, and the corrupter, which is the personal thing facilitating the corrupting. And again, applying this to information disorder, who or what is doing the corrupting at a very general level is often the institution or individual which is creating or sharing false information. So this could be a media outlet publishing false news stories in order to harm a presidential candidate, disinformation, or a social media user sharing a parody article as if it was real, which would be misinformation. So in these examples, the corrupter would be the media outlet and the social media user, and then whoever's been exposed to these articles or social posts would be the corruptee. Okay, so these are the 5 modes of epistemic corruption, which indicate some of the main ways that an epistemic agent could become epistemically vicious as a result of their interaction with the corrupter. And for this talk, I'm just going to take 2 of these modes and apply them to information disorder. So I'm going to focus on number 3, which is propagation. So a corrupter can increase the scope of a vice, which is the extent to which it affects the range of a subject's character. And then also number 5, so intensification, a corrupter can increase the strength of a vice. So the first epistemic vice, which I think is promoted by information disorder, is the vice of prejudice. And this is understood as, to quote, a negatively charged, materially false stereotype targeting some social group and the individuals that comprise this group. And then according to Miranda Fricker, it can be defined in a slightly stronger sense as a judgment made or maintained without proper regard to the evidence. So Fricker has extensively discussed the vicious nature of prejudice with regards to epistemic injustice. And one type of injustice that's identified by her is testimonial injustice, which is when a speaker's testimony isn't believed due to the hearer's prejudice of the speaker. And just to say a bit more about the vicious nature of testimonial injustice, so alongside Fricker, a very prominent vice epistemologist, Heather Battley, discusses how testimonial injustice could be understood as a vice because it consistently produces bad epistemic effects. So it could impede the transmission of knowledge, or it could express bad epistemic values and motives. And then another prominent vice epistemologist, Kasim Kassam, also discusses the vicious nature of prejudice and testimonial injustice. And he defines this as an attitude epistemic vice, which is an attitude formed and sustained without proper consideration of the merits or demerits of an object. And attitude vices are vices because they prevent the gaining and sharing of knowledge, according to Kassam. Okay, so given these definitions of prejudice and its vicious nature, I think we can now return to Kidd's 5 modes of corruption, because I think that information disorder can actually strengthen the vice of prejudice in accordance with mode 5. So to demonstrate this, we can consider a case of testimonial injustice, which is brought about by information disorder. And examples of this can be found in the various reports which followed the recent Black Lives Matter protests, which falsely reported or exaggerated incidents of violence during these protests. So exaggerations were displayed in headlines such as these. So we've got a night of fire and fury across America as protests intensify. And the New York Times appeal for calm as spawning protests threatened to spiral out of control. However, these reports contradicted the actual peaceful nature of the protests, as evidence actually showed that no more than 93% of the protests were peaceful and resulted in no serious harm to people or damage to property. And additionally, media outlets shared false information, which added to this narrative of the Black Lives Matter protests as being violent. So examples included viral videos of seemingly innocent bystanders being beaten by protesters, which was shared by the Daily Mail, and even then President Donald Trump. And other examples included false reports that the protesters had hijacked a train, set fire to supermarkets, and killed police officers. So by presenting the Black Lives Matter protests and the actual entire movement as threatening and dangerous through forms of disinformation, the peaceful message and credibility of the protests was suppressed and delegitimized. And this is a case of testimonial injustice and epistemic prejudice, because the media's false reports and racial stereotyping of the protesters reduced the credibility of the movement through these false depictions of the protesters as dangerous and violent. And arguably, this can lead consumers of these news stories to then form prejudice against the Black Lives Matter protesters, or I think at the very least, in accordance with mode 5 of Kidd's mode of corruption, it can actually strengthen a racial prejudice that someone already holds by reconfirming their false belief that Black people are violent, for example. And this also relates to research which supports the claim that false depictions of Black Lives Matter content is based on racial stereotyping. And there's a report which argues how the media's image of Black people, particularly men, as thugs or brutish, creates a depiction of Black people as violent, which they found in turn created various prejudices and misconceptions. So I think this is just one of the examples of how information disorder can actually strengthen the vice of prejudice. So the second vice, which I think is promoted by information disorder, is the vice of conspiracy thinking. And this vice is again discussed in depth by Kassam. So he first defines it as a vicious character trait, then a thinking vice, and then more recently as an ideology. I'm just going to focus on his definition of it as a thinking vice, because I think this suits the type of conspiracy thinking that we see in relation to information disorder. So according to Kassam, a thinking vice is an epistemically vicious way of thinking, so a way of thinking that obstructs knowledge, which concerns the qualities of a person's thinking rather than the qualities of them as a thinker. And Kassam appeals to the definition of thinking as a method of choosing amongst potential possibilities. And he states that different ways of thinking are just different ways of doing this. So different ways of including or excluding possibilities or drawing conclusions. When these activities get in the way of knowledge, they can then become potential epistemic vices. So Kassam discusses how thinking vices can make us more error prone, and they therefore aren't a reliable pathway to true belief. And they can also reduce an agent's confidence in their belief. And this is the confidence condition for knowledge. So Kassam states that for you to know the truth of proposition P, you have to be reasonably confident in P and possess the right to be confident in P. However, thinking vices can undermine an agent's right to be confident in P because the confidence isn't based on evidence, but these bad ways of thinking. So an agent would only have the right to be confident if their belief was reasonable and formed using a reliable method. So applying this to the vice of conspiracy thinking, for an epistemic agent to be confident in their conspiracy theory that the 9/11 attacks were an inside government job, for example, their confidence in this belief would have to be based on reliable evidence. However, as we've seen, Kassam argues that conspiracy thinking involves these ways of thinking, which include jumping to false conclusions and tying together unrelated events, which means an agent should lack confidence in their belief. So again, bringing the discussion back to Kidd's 5 modes of epistemic corruption, I think we can see how conspiracy theories increase the scope, the vice of conspiracy thinking in accordance with mode 3. So for example, consider an individual who believes the conspiracy theory that the MMR vaccine causes autism in children who are vaccinated with it. The individual then comes across a new conspiracy theory which claims that the COVID-19 vaccination is part of a secret plan by Bill Gates to implant trackable microchips into all of those who are vaccinated with it. Prior to this conspiracy theory, the individual only possessed a conspiracy mindset about the health implications of vaccines, but now they also believe there's a number of privacy concerns around vaccinations as well. So from this example, I think it seems clear that the scope of the vice, the conspiracy thinking vice, has been propagated by the presence of information disorder in the form of conspiracy theories. Okay, so having laid out the 2 vices, which I think are propagated and intensified by information disorder, we can now turn to discuss the ameliorative functions of our corruption criticism, which just aims to offer some solutions to these vices and the corruptive nature of information disorder. So Kidd notes that a corruption criticism can possess conditionality claims and corrective claims. So the former describe conditions that have to be in place for corruptive tendencies to be possible. And this can include certain aims, practices, or cultures which enable, incentivize, or in some other way encourage the development and exercise of vice. So if these features can be removed, then the system would be contingently corrupting. However, when the corrupting conditions are just intrinsically corrupting, the features would therefore be integral to the actual system. So the corruption could only be eradicated if the entire system was dismantled altogether. So turning our attention back to the media and the various forms of information disorder, I think we can identify this as conditionally corruptive because it's information disorder itself, which exemplifies the corruptive conditions, not the entire online media environment or system. So as argued for by Kidd and many other vice epistemologists, solutions or corrective measures which are directed towards vices should be both individualistic, which just means directed at the vicious individual, and also institutional or collective, which just means directed at the vice-promoting institution or the wider environment. And I'm going to note here that given that I'm focusing on harm done to epistemic character for information disorder, the solution that I'm going to very briefly touch on is also based on epistemic character and virtues, but I don't think that's the only way to overcome the various problems associated with information disorder. So I'm just going to conclude with 2 possible corrective claims, one individualistic and one more structural or hybrid approach. So for an individualistic solution first, we can turn to literature in applied virtue epistemology. And one example is discussed by both Jason Bear and Duncan Pritchard, which is educating for virtues and identifying the various intellectual virtues which should be fostered and promoted for effective cognitive inquiry. So if information disorder is promoting intellectual vices, one way to combat this would be to therefore just promote an individual's intellectual virtues in order to counter or eradicate a vice. So the first virtue, which we should be educating for here, is open-mindedness. This is defined as a willingness to consider alternative views and an ability to revise your efforts in light of new evidence. And this virtue can closely counter the vice of intellectual prejudice, which we saw consisted of making and maintaining false judgments without a proper regard for the evidence. So potentially, by educating for open-mindedness, agents who are disposed to false information, which would support their prejudice and intensify it, would instead learn to update and revise their belief by considering alternative, accurate information and different viewpoints. And then we can also consider the virtue of intellectual carefulness. So this is defined as a trait of being cautious and avoiding intellectual error. I think there's some overlap between this virtue and others, but intellectual carefulness would seem most apt to counter the vice of conspiratorial thinking, which we've seen that agents display when they sort of draw false conclusions and exaggerated connections between unconnected events. And intellectual carefulness is actually described by a philosopher called Richard Hismink, and he defines this as an actual virtue of the internet. And he notes that being able to avoid mistakes requires an awareness of situations where common mistakes are made, which means a basic understanding of logic and critical thinking skills is necessary. And also Heather Batterley discusses how virtues such as intellectual carefulness should be taught as part of undergraduate courses in logic or critical thinking. And she proposes that this can also include internet literacy skills. So there are actually arguments out there which support the claim that educating people with certain virtues could potentially help them navigate online environments and information disorder. I do think, though, that whilst it seems true that cultivating and exercising good cognitive skills and virtues could assist in reducing the vices being promoted by information disorder, as I previously noted, individualistic or self-improvement centered solutions might not always be the best suited or most effective corrective claims. And I think this appears to be particularly true for information disorder, which, as I've discussed, actually creates these corrupting conditions which prevents agents from forming and exercising intellectual virtues. And additionally, we might think that because the problem lies in the actual corrupting conditions of information disorder, arguably we should direct our corrective claims towards information disorder itself, as opposed to individuals who are being subject to these vices. So with this in mind, we might explore a possible hybrid solution, which takes both these individualistic and systematic approaches into account. And one example of this is offered by Emily Sullivan and Mark Alfano. So in their very recent paper called Vectors of Epistemic Insecurity, they discuss how virtues could help make your epistemic environment more secure. So they discuss social epistemic networks and identify 3 different classes of virtues which could assist in this. So they identify monitoring, adjusting, and restructuring. Each of these virtues is both self-regarding, which just means it concerns the individual, and other-regarding, which means it concerns the wider network, which makes it this individualistic and structural solution. So I'm just going to finish by outlining this possible solution. So briefly, monitoring requires you to monitor and understand the structure of a social network, as well as monitoring the epistemic roles and track records of those in this network. So you can monitor your own network, which would be self-regarding, or others, which would be other-regarding. And successful virtuous monitoring allows agents to actively keep track of their epistemic position in various different domains and contexts. So recognizing your position in an epistemic echo chamber, for example. And monitoring your social network would also involve adjusting the weight that you give to sources and information being spread throughout your network. So by doing this successfully, you'll be able to adjust your credence to account for imperfections such as cases of mis or disinformation. And again, adjustment can be focused on your own network, which would be self-regarding, or others, which would be other-regarding. So suggesting that an agent puts more or less trust in various different sources in their social epistemic network, for example. And this can be beneficial because it can benefit others by suggesting what amount of trust to give to various sources. And then finally, virtuous restructuring concerns social networks which are just so flawed that they need to be entirely modified. And this is similar to Kidd's discussion on contingent and intrinsic corrupting systems. So Sullivan and Alfano note that you can rewire your social network, your own one, which would be self-regarding, or the social networks of others, which would be other-regarding. And as with these other virtues, restructuring would be with the aim of epistemic improvement. So this could include excluding unreliable testifiers or sources from your network. And just to finish on a concern that you might still have with this view, which is that it could be argued the solution is just still too individualistic. It still focuses on the formation of virtues in individuals, even if it's concerned with promoting virtues in your wider community and your social networks. So it's still centered around individuals forming virtues, to overcome or reduce the harms caused by information disorder. And perhaps, even though I said I would only focus on epistemic character-based solutions, you might just think that these type of solutions are just going to be too weak. And instead we should turn to areas outside of philosophy or just outside of these character-based solutions, which deal with dismantling information disorder, which would then in turn rid of the corruption and promotion of vice. Okay, so just to summarize everything that I've said then, so I've argued that information disorder, which is understood as the correct way to refer to the problem of fake news and other related phenomena, can be epistemically harmful to your intellectual character insofar as it can promote intellectual vices. I followed Kidd's framework for a successful corruption criticism. So I outlined how the media, insofar as it produces information disorder, is epistemically corrupting. I began by identifying the corrupter and the corruptees, which was the media and its consumers. And then I identified two distinct epistemic vices, which information disorder leads to, which was prejudice and conspiracy thinking. I discussed how these vices are brought about by information disorder in accordance with Kidd's 5 modes of corruption. So I focused on how vices could be intensified and propagated. And then finally, I concluded by examining the various ways that information disorder could overcome its corruptive state. So I assessed individualistic and structural collective and relative solutions. I think that's the last slide, yeah.